Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lecture on your heart. This is chapter 14. Our heart is about the size of a fist, and it sits just a bit to the left of center behind our sternum, in the body cavity called our mediastinum. Kind of counterintuitive, but the superior or top part of the heart is known as the base, and the inferior or bottom part of the heart comes to a slight point, and that's called the apex. Even though the top is called the base, you can use it as a reference for the base of all the great vessels that come into and leave out of the heart. If you were to listen to your heartbeat with the stethoscope, the loudest location that you would hear your heart would be down at the apex. The key structures of the heart that we're going to cover are the pericardium, the heart wall, the chambers within, and the valves separating each chamber. Starting with the pericardium, this is the double-walled sac that surrounds the whole heart. It's the outermost layer that anchors the heart to the surrounding tissue. The pericardium has two layers to it. The fibrous layer is the outer layer, and the serous layer is the inner layer. Now, the serous pericardium actually has two layers of its own. The top layer, which butts up against the fibrous pericardium, is the parietal layer, and the bottom layer, most inward along the surface of the heart, is the visceral layer. So let's walk through the pericardium from outermost to innermost. First, you start with the outermost fibrous pericardium, and it connects to all the surrounding tissue. Stepping inward, you've got the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. And then one more layer in is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. In between the parietal and the visceral layers is a space or a cavity filled with fluid called serous fluid. This allows a cushion around the heart to prevent any friction as the muscle moves during our heartbeats. Now let's talk about the heart wall. The heart wall has three layers to it. So, just to confuse you, the outermost layer of the heart wall is the same thing as the innermost layer of the pericardium. This is called the epicardium, also known as the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. This layer is made up of squamous epithelial cells. Now, the thickest layer of the heart wall, which is actually made up of cardiac muscle, is known as the myocardium. This muscle performs the work of the heartbeat. And then a thin layer of squamous epithelial cells line the innermost part of the heart wall, covers the valves, and continues into the vessels where they're connected, and this is called the endocardium. Remember, the inner layer of the vessels is called the endothelium, and this adjoins perfectly with the endocardium within the inside of the heart. This endocardium layer is very smooth, as to prevent any clotting from happening within the heart. On to the heart chambers. There are four hollow chambers, two upper ones called atria and two lower ones called ventricles. They are also divided into right and left. The right and left reference is how it would be within the body, not as we are looking at it. So be sure to always use anatomical position as your reference for right and left. The right and left atria are separated by the interatrial septum. Think of the atria as filling chambers or reservoirs, as they serve as a collecting spot for blood coming from the body or blood coming from the lungs. The heart wall surrounding the atria are not as thick as the heart wall surrounding the ventricles. The reason why is that the atria, when they contract, they only have to move blood down into the ventricles, so not very far. However, the ventricles, which receive blood from the atria, have to push the blood either into the lungs, which is done by the right ventricle, or out into the rest of the body, which is done by the left ventricle, and therefore they have really thick walls. On that note, do you think that one ventricle might have a thicker wall than the other ventricle? If you answered yes, you're correct. The left ventricle is thicker, as where it has to pump blood all the way through the rest of the body. Just like the atria are separated from each other, the right and left ventricles are separated by the interventricular septum. Take a look at this image and see if you can find all the chambers on the image. Now let's talk about the great vessels. So no matter if a vessel is blue or red in the pictures, vessels with blood going into the heart will always be called veins, and vessels with blood going away from the heart will always be called arteries. The large veins and arteries that connect to the heart are what are known as the great vessels, but they have specific names. Let's go through them in order that blood will flow through the heart. So, blood is coming from our body toward the heart in veins, and eventually all the veins will merge into two major veins, the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. Blood will then flow into the right atrium. Then it gets pumped into the right ventricle. Blood will then exit the heart, being pumped by the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. This is called an artery because it leaves the heart, and then they branch left and right toward the left and right lung. This is where the lungs do their job in oxygenating the blood and removing carbon dioxide. We'll talk about this in the next chapter. Then the blood will come back to the heart via the left and the right pulmonary veins. Blood then fills the left atrium. The left atrium pumps the blood into the left ventricle. Then the left ventricle pumps super hard to send the blood out of the aorta, the big red artery at the top, and out to the rest of the body. Now we know that blood flows in one direction through the heart, so how do you think it prevents the blood from flowing backwards? Valves exist to prevent this backflow. Since we're looking at this side view, let's go ahead and talk about the valves. Think about the direction of flow that the blood travels, starting with the blood entering heart. The first one-way valve that the blood will encounter is between the right atrium and right ventricle. This valve is called the tricuspid valve. The next place that blood will encounter a valve is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. This valve is called the pulmonary valve. Blood will then go into the lungs and out of the lungs and back into the heart and drain into the left atrium. And the next place blood will encounter a valve is between this left atrium and left ventricle. This valve is called the mitral or bicuspid valve. And finally, as blood is about to exit the heart, the last place to prevent backflow and the last valve is between the left ventricle and aorta. This one is called the aortic valve. Take a look at the 4 valves from this point of view now. We're looking down onto the top of the heart. Each valve has 2 or 3 flaps of tissue called cusps or leaflets. So let's imagine our ventricles are relaxed. No blood is being pushed into the pulmonary circuit or out to the body. Which valves might be closed here? The correct answer is the pulmonary and aortic valves will be closed. These 2 valves can be categorized together and referenced as the semilunar valves. Now imagine the ventricles are contracted and pushing blood into the pulmonary circuit and out to the body. Now which valves might be closed? The correct answer is the tricuspid and mitral valves. They are preventing backflow into the atria when the ventricles are contracting. These 2 valves can also be referenced together as the atrioventricular valves. Now on the last slide, we walked through the direction of blood flow, and it seems like each chamber of the heart will contract on its own as it flows in sequence. But actually, both atria contract together and both ventricles contract together. This is why you see 2 valves closed when the ventricles are relaxed and 2 valves closed when the ventricles are contracted. There's a ring around each valve that's actually pretty rigid as to not let the valves collapse. This rigid tissue is known as what is the skeleton of the heart. It keeps the valves from stretching as well as from collapsing. Also, as electrical impulses travel through the heart to regulate the heart rhythm, this skeleton insulates each chamber, preventing the impulse from reaching the unwanted areas. Pause the lecture here and open your Complete Anatomy app. See if you can identify the layers of the pericardium, the layers of the heart wall, all of the great vessels, and the chambers and the valves. When you've been to the doctor for a checkup, they will listen to your heart in various places on your chest and your back. When the valves close, they actually produce a vibration, and that is what the doctor is listening for with the stethoscope. Take a look at this slide and see if you can identify where each of these heart sounds can be heard. First, you have the aortic area. This is positioned in between the second intercostal space between the second and the third rib, to the right of your sternum. Then the pulmonic area, also in the second intercostal space, but on the left side of the sternum. The tricuspid area is the 4th or 5th intercostal space and on the left side of the sternal border. Then the mitral area, which is basically the apex, is the 5th intercostal space and left of the mid-clavicular line. Let's walk through the flow of blood through the heart again and identify each part along the way. Keep in mind, though, that the atria contract together and the ventricles contract together. You can also follow along in your Complete Anatomy app. Number 1. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood returning from the body through the superior and inferior vena cava. 2. Once that right atrium is full, it contracts. This forces the tricuspid valve open, and the blood flows into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle is full, the tricuspid valve snaps closed and prevents blood from flowing backward into the atrium. After filling, the right ventricle contracts, forcing the pulmonary valve open. Blood is then pumped into the right and left pulmonary arteries and out to the lungs. After the right ventricle empties, the pulmonary valve closes to prevent the blood from flowing backward into the ventricle. 4. After replenishing its supply of oxygen and cleansing itself of carbon dioxide, the blood will then enter the pulmonary veins and returns to the heart through the left atrium. When the left atrium is full, it contracts. This forces the mitral or bicuspid valve open, and blood is then pumped into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle is full, the mitral valve closes to prevent backflow. The ventricle then contracts, forcing the aortic valve open, allowing blood to flow into the aorta. From there, oxygenated blood is distributed to every organ in the body. Our heart pumps all of the blood our body needs through our systemic circulatory system. But the heart itself, the heart tissue, also needs blood of its own. This is what the coronary circulation does. This is the heart's own vascular system to keep it supplied with oxygen and nutrients. The right and the left coronary arteries come right off the aorta. This provides blood to the heart that has just been oxygenated. The right coronary artery supplies the right atrium, part of the left atrium, most of the right ventricle, and the inferior part of the left ventricle. The left coronary artery supplies the left atrium, most of the left ventricle, and most of the interventricular septum. This left coronary artery branches into two other named arteries, the anterior descending and the circumflex arteries. The veins then collect the deoxygenated blood after it's been perfused into the cardiac tissue and empties the blood into the coronary sinus, which is located on the posterior side of the heart. This sinus then drains the deoxygenated blood right back into the right atrium for it to be pumped into the lungs again. A heart attack, also known as a myocardial infarction, is when blood is cut off somewhere within this coronary circulation. Cardiac tissue cannot survive even a second without blood. And so if the tissue becomes ischemic, meaning no blood flow, it will cause pain and eventual tissue death. The amount of blockage in the tissue that is ischemic can vary, and therefore someone can have a mild heart attack or have what's known as the widowmaker heart attack, when the blockage occurs above the branches, therefore rendering a large portion of the heart ischemic. The chest pain that can accompany a heart attack or even stand alone, is called angina. Say a coronary artery is partially blocked, perhaps by the disease called atherosclerosis. Some blood flow is going to go through, but not a lot. Then let's say this person starts shoveling a lot of snow, requiring the heart to beat faster and work harder to supply the muscles in the body. If the heart is working harder, then it will need more blood also. If there is a partial blockage, but the demand for blood to the heart outpaces what can be supplied, the tissue will become ischemic and angina, the chest pain, will occur. Now, what controls our heartbeat and the heartbeat rhythm? Electrical impulses originating within the heart itself transmit in a specific route to cause these contractions. Instead of being innervated by nerves, like other muscles in our body, cardiac tissue has their own ability to depolarize, generate action potential, and repolarize just like neurons do. This ability to generate its own electrical impulse is called automaticity. Special cells, called pacemaker cells, have this automaticity ability. Let's walk through this specific route that the impulse travels throughout the heart. Step 1. An electrical impulse is generated by the sinoatrial node, or SA node, the ultimate pacemaker, located in the wall of the right atrium. Step 2. A bundle of conducting fibers rapidly conducts this impulse from the right atrium over to the left atrium, and both atria begin to contract. Step 3. The impulse also travels along 3 bundles to the atrioventricular node, or AV node, which is another set of pacemaker cells that are located at the lower end of the right atria. When the impulse enters the AV node, it slows down considerably to allow the atria to contract and the ventricles to fill. Step 4. The impulse will pass through the AV node and then pick up speed again. Next, it travels down the bundle of His, or the AV bundle. Step 5. The AV bundle branches into a right and a left bundle branch, which are also pacemaker cells, and the impulse travels in this direction. Step 6. The Purkinje fibers then take that impulse through the muscles of the left and the right ventricles and cause them to contract simultaneously. The Purkinje fibers are also pacemaker cells. Basically, any of these pacemaker cells along this pathway are capable of firing an impulse. This allows other parts of the heart to take over if the primary parts fail. However, their rate of firing will differ and be quite slower than if the SA node is actually setting the pace. These impulses traveling through the heart can be picked up by a machine called an electrocardiogram, or ECG. Basically, sticky electrodes are placed in strategic places on a person's chest where wires will transmit the signal to a computer. The currents traveling through the heart will indicate a pattern drawn by this computer, and the machine does not pick up the contractions of the chambers, it only picks up the electrical signals traveling through the heart. So this is what a normal heart rhythm will look like. If the rhythm is not normal, it's called an arrhythmia. There's varying types and causes to arrhythmias. Let's walk through this picture and talk about what each part represents in this process of the electrical conduction. First, the P wave. The P wave at the beginning represents atrial depolarization, or the transmission of electrical impulses from the SA node through the atria. This P wave occurs right before the atrial contract. The PR interval represents the time it takes for the cardiac impulse to travel from the atria down to the ventricles. The QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization, basically the spread of electrical impulses throughout the ventricles. The ventricles contract somewhere within the QRS complex. The ST segment represents the end of ventricular depolarization and the beginning of ventricular repolarization. The T wave represents full-on ventricular repolarization. If you notice, I never mentioned atrial repolarization. The reason why is this is happening at some point during the QRS complex. But because the QRS complex, or the ventricular depolarization signal, is so strong, it basically drowns out the atrial repolarization signal. Let's combine it all together. The impulse conduction sequence, the contraction, and then the relaxation of the chambers. This series of events, basically what happens from the beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next, is what is known as the cardiac cycle. The two states, which represent contraction and relaxation, are called systole and diastole. The atria begin with systole, then relax in diastole. Meanwhile, the ventricles are in systole, and then finally relax in diastole. The vibrations of the muscles during this contraction, and along with the closures of the valves, is what produces that lub-dub sound of the heartbeat. The first heart sound that you can hear is called S1. And the second softer sound you can hear is called S2. The cardiac cycle is divided into 5 phases. Here are all of the events that happen within each phase. I want you to visualize what's going on as I talk through this. In fact, I recommend drawing a normal rhythm of an ECG and then labeling on that diagram what's happening in each phase. So in phase 1, also known as passive ventricular filling, returning blood fills the atria and the atrial pressure increases. This increasing pressure opens those atrioventricular valves, and this allows some passive filling of blood into the ventricles. The P wave appears on an ECG, marking the end of atrial depolarization at this point. In phase 2, atrial systole, the atrioventricular valves are open from earlier, and the semilunar valves are closed. But what happens is the atria contracts, and basically this ejects any remaining blood in the atria down into the ventricles. The ventricles are relaxed at this point and they're filling. Phase 3 is isovolumetric contraction. The ventricles are beginning to contract now, but the semilunar valves have not opened yet. This increases the pressure in the ventricles. The R wave appears on the ECG, and the first heart sound can be heard. And that sound comes from the vibrations of the ventricles contracting and the slamming shut of the atrioventricular valves because of that pressure increase in the ventricles. In phase 4, ventricular ejection, you'll see that the semilunar valves open up. They do this because the AV valves have closed in the last phase and the pressure increases in the ventricles to the maximum of the contraction. This pushes the semilunar valves open and blood leaves each ventricle. However, some blood remains in the ventricles. This is called residual volume. This is basically at the end of when the ventricles contract. And this is represented on the ECG as the T wave. Phase 5, isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. So what happens here is the semilunar valves end up slamming shut. This is where you hear the second heart sound, S2. But still, the AV valves are closed. They have not opened yet. And so at this point, the ventricles are relaxed and the atria are relaxed. And this is represented at the end of the T wave on the ECG. So on your ECG drawing, it should look like this. At the top of your P wave, atrial depolarization, this is phase 1. The AV valves are open, the semilunar valves are closed, and the atria begin to contract and the ventricles are relaxed. Phase 2, atrial systole, is basically right in between the P and the Q. The atria contract fully here and the ventricles fill. The AV valves are open and the semilunar valves are still closed. And then in phase 3 is represented at the top of the R wave. The ventricles begin to contract, it's ventricle depolarization, but the atria are relaxed. The semilunar valves are still closed, but now the AV valves slam shut. This is S1. Phase 4 happens somewhere in between S and T. The ventricles are fully contracted and the atria are relaxed. The semilunar valves are open and the AV valves are still closed. Phase 5 represented kind of right at the end of the T wave. The semilunar valves slam shut. This is S2. And the AV valves are still closed. The ventricles are relaxed and the atria are relaxed. You can actually calculate the workload of your heart by measuring the cardiac output. Cardiac output is basically how much blood your heart can pump within 1 minute. Here's the equation on the slide. First, you have to find your heart rate, which is how many beats per minute. Let's use the average adult heart rate at rest around 75 beats per minute. Your stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped with each one of those heartbeats. Let's also use an average of 70 milliliters of blood for the heart to eject with one beat at rest. So to determine your cardiac output, you would multiply 75 by 70. And you would end up with 5,250 milliliters per minute. Converting that to liters, it comes out to about 5 liters per minute. Ironically, this is about the total amount of blood you have in your body, 5 liters. So let's say your heart rate changed, like when you exercise. Let's say it increased. Would your cardiac output then go up? Yes, it would. How about if someone has a diminished stroke volume, say from tissue death post-heart attack? Would their resting cardiac output go down? Yes. But to maintain 5 liters of circulation per minute, what might the heart have to do to compensate for a lower stroke volume? It would have to increase the heart rate. Now let's say a highly trained athlete has a larger stroke volume, meaning way more than 70 milliliters of blood pumped at each heartbeat. What might the heart do to keep cardiac output at about 5 liters per minute at rest? The heart rate would decrease. This is part of the training adaptations with exercise. You can tell a lot about a person's heart health just by measuring these factors. Your pulse, or your heart rate, is the number of times your heart beats each minute. This will be different at rest, while you're sleeping, when you're walking, when you're running, and when you're nervous. Many things affect your pulse. I'd like you all to practice taking your pulse. Pull out your phones and find your stopwatch. Now take your pointer and middle finger and find the carotid artery on your neck. You should feel the pulse there. You will count how many times you feel this pulse within 1 minute. When you are ready to go, take a deep breath, pause this video, and begin counting as soon as you hit begin on your timer. Count how many beats happen in 1 minute. A resting heart rate lower than 60 is considered bradycardia, and a resting heart rate over 100 is considered tachycardia. If you find that you're in between those two numbers, you're pretty much just normal. Although your heart generates and maintains its own beat, your nervous system can influence your rhythm as well as the force of your contractions. The medulla oblongata in your brain is where your cardiac center is located, and it contains an acceleratory center and an inhibitory center. This is all part of your autonomic nervous system, basically the nervous system that works without you knowing it. Things like exercise and stress stimulate the sympathetic division, which increases your heart rate. Things like sleep stimulates your parasympathetic division and lowers your heart rate. This cardiac center in your medulla oblongata receives input from several sources. Proprioceptors, which are sense organs in your muscles and your joints, they signal changes in physical activity, allowing the heart to increase its output before the muscles demand more blood. Baroreceptors, which are pressure sense organs, are located in your blood vessels. and they detect changes in blood pressure. If your blood pressure falls, cardiac output will decrease, and therefore the acceleratory center in your medulla will stimulate the heart to beat faster to maintain your cardiac output. And vice versa if your blood pressure rises suddenly. Also, chemoreceptors, which are chemical sensors, detect changes in gases in your blood, such as carbon dioxide levels, oxygen levels, or even changes in pH. For example, if pH drops, becomes more acidic, CO2 increases, and O2 decreases, your sympathetic nervous system will increase your heart rate to circulate more blood. Also, your ventilation will increase to eliminate more CO2 and bring the pH back up. Remember that your ventricles never eject the full 100% of blood. There's always a bit remaining. Typically, your ventricles will eject about 60 to 80% of their volume. This is known as your ejection fraction. If your ejection fraction is lower than that, it signifies a weakened or failing ventricle. If you measure ejection fraction in milliliters instead of a percent of volume, that's what your stroke volume is. Remember, stroke volume is part of the equation when measuring cardiac output. And cardiac output is how much blood your heart pumps in 1 minute, and stroke volume is how much blood is pumped in 1 heartbeat. So 3 factors affect your stroke volume. You've got preload, contractility, and afterload. Preload is the amount of stretch or tension in your ventricles when it's super full of blood. Think about how a balloon blown up stretches and will have pressure inside of it. This is preload. The more blood you have in your ventricles, the greater the preload. Contractility is how forceful your ventricles can eject the blood. If the tissue is healthy and fit, it will have higher contractility. If the tissue is old or necrotic, it will have a low contractility. Also, like a balloon, the more stretch, the more force of the contraction after. Think about a rubber band. A brand new rubber band will snap back quickly when it's stretched. But an old, used rubber band will have a weakened snap because it's been overstretched in time. Afterload is how much pressure the heart has to push against. If you have high blood pressure in your vessels, this will cause a high afterload and therefore affect the stroke volume by decreasing it. If your heart doesn't have to work so hard against the vessels, then your stroke volume will be increased. Think of your vessels leaving your heart as a garden hose leaving the faucet. If the hose is narrow or constricted, then less water will make it through. Same goes for your vessels. A narrowing or an inability to stretch creates more afterload, opposing the pressure from the contraction, and it will decrease stroke volume. Flexible and wide vessels decreases the afterload, therefore increases the stroke volume. Your left ventricle is quite important as its health determines how well you circulate blood throughout your body. Chronic high blood pressure or damaged heart valves force your left ventricle to work a lot harder. Imagine how weak your heart can get if it's fighting against high blood pressure for years or even decades. This is why hypertension or high blood pressure is so important to treat. If this unfortunately happens, the left ventricle becomes weak over time. Blood can even actually begin to back up into the lungs if the ventricle becomes weak. Symptoms such as shortness of breath, swelling in your lungs, or chronic coughing result from this backup of left ventricular failure. If either the left or the right ventricle fail, it's what is known as congestive heart failure. It's a backup in the system. Just like traffic on the highway can get congested, a backup in the system in your heart is called congestion. Now, if the right ventricle fails, usually due to lung disease, blood will back up now into the vena cavas and then throughout the veins of the rest of your body. Generalized swelling all over, pooling of fluid in the abdomen, enlargement of even the liver and the spleen are all symptoms of severe right ventricular failure. Typically, this happens after the lungs have begun to fail. Because the right ventricle pumps into the pulmonary circuit, diseased lungs can cause this type of congestion. Heart disease, which encompasses congestive heart failure, atherosclerosis, and other heart conditions, is the leading cause of death in the U.S. However, a large percentage of these diseases, especially the ones diagnosed under the age of 65, are preventable. Regular physical activity and a diet low in refined sugar and high in micronutrients keeps our heart healthy. This lifestyle decreases our blood pressure, keeps the cardiac muscles fit, and allows our blood to flow regularly through our bodies. So this concludes the lecture about the heart. Please email me if you have any questions, and I'll catch you next time.